Daniel Green gripped the steering wheel as the headlights cut through the dark, empty road. The car engine hummed like a distant drone, filling the oppressive silence that hung around him. He was driving alone, but it wasn't just the physical solitude that weighed on him. The real burden was inside him. The pain of losing Emily was still raw, like an open wound. He was on his way to her funeral, the woman he loved, and who was no longer with him. Every mile brought him closer to a place he never wanted to visit, but now it was inevitable. The cruel irony was that the only road to the cemetery was the same where the accident had happened, the very spot where Emily's life was brutally taken. Daniel blinked, trying to push away the memories of the argument that triggered their last conversation. That night he had been at home, angry and distracted, while Emily was coming back from her mother's house. The argument, which started over something trivial, had quickly escalated into something much bigger, much more painful. She wanted a child. He had always known that, and she had never hidden that desire. But Daniel, he kept postponing it. He postponed the conversation, postponed the decision, always hiding behind excuses about work, finances, and the fear of failing. When Emily brought it up again that night, he lost control. His words had been cruel. The last thing he had said to her was something terrible, something he would now give anything to forget, but he couldn't. Daniel thought bitterly, why do you always have to pick the worst times to talk about it? She had cried silently on the other end of the line, and he, blinded by anger, had hung up the phone. That was the last time he spoke to Emily alive. Hours later came the call telling him about the accident. Now, driving down the same road where it all happened, Daniel felt his chest tighten. He would pass the accident site within minutes. Each time he had to take this route, he knew he would be forced to relive the pain. The inside of the car was strangely cold, despite the heater being on. Daniel fiddled with the dashboard controls, but the temperature kept dropping. The cold wasn't physical, he felt something else. It was an invisible presence pressing down on him, making the air around him denser, heavier. He glanced in the rearview mirror just out of reflex and saw the empty back seat. But there was a growing unease inside him, a feeling that the emptiness he saw wasn't real. Something was changing. He didn't know what it was, but he was about to find out. The road ahead stretched endlessly, a lonely line disappearing into the dark horizon. Daniel had been driving for hours, but the emotional exhaustion was what affected him the most. The image of Emily, as he had last seen her, filled every corner of his mind. The sound of the phone falling silent after their last fight echoed like a lament inside his head. He adjusted his shoulders in the seat, trying to focus on the road. But then the first sound came, soft and indistinct, like a faint rustling. He blinked, instinctively glancing in the rearview mirror. Nothing. The back seat was still empty, but something bothered him. It was as if the silence was filled with something more, something he couldn't identify. Trying to shake off the feeling, he refocused on the road. But the sound returned, clearer this time, like someone was shifting in the back seat. Daniel swallowed hard, feeling a shiver run down his spine. "I'm just tired," Daniel thought, disoriented. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself it was just stress, grief, the long drive. But then the sound came again, louder this time. Now he was sure it was the sound of someone breathing, a soft, rhythmic breathing, as if someone was sitting right behind him. Daniel slowly turned his head, his eyes locked on the back seat. His heart pounded in his chest. When he finally turned fully, what he saw wasn't the emptiness he expected. There, on the back seat, the indistinct shape of a silhouette began to form, as if the air around it was growing denser. He blinked, startled, his heart racing even faster. Daniel thought, terrified, this can't be happening. Suddenly, he pulled the car over with a jolt. The engine still hummed as he looked back again, but the figure had disappeared. All that was left was the emptiness, the same emptiness he had felt in his chest since learning of Emily's death. Daniel sat there, motionless for a few moments, breathing heavily. What had he seen, or rather, what did he think he had seen? Still confused and shaken, he refocused on the road. But now something had changed. He knew he wasn't alone anymore. The weight inside the car increased with every mile. The cold was relentless, and what he had seen, or thought he had seen, wouldn't leave his mind. His breath became quicker, his thoughts spiraled with doubt. He was beginning to question his sanity, but deep down, something told him it was real. The presence was with him, getting closer. Once again, he glanced at the rearview mirror. At first, everything seemed normal, but then a silhouette began to form again. This time, it wasn't an indistinct shadow. It was clearer, more real. Emily, she was there, or at least something that looked like her, sitting in the back seat, her head slightly tilted, watching him in an eerily silent way. But it wasn't the Emily he remembered. Her face was pale, with bloodstains running down the side of her forehead, the same wound he had heard about after the accident. Her hair, which he had always found so beautiful and shiny, was now wet, darkened by shadows that seemed to cling to her. Emily looked at Daniel darkly. Daniel let out an involuntary scream, and the car swerved on the road as he struggled to control it. He pulled over again, this time more violently, his heart pounding in his chest. When he looked again, the seat was empty, the absolute emptiness like before, but he knew something was different. The silence around him seemed to be charged with her presence. He could feel it. She was there, and she wasn't leaving. He sat there for a few more moments, his heart still racing, trying to understand what had just happened. He knew that whatever he had seen or felt wasn't going to stop. Emily was with him now. Daniel kept driving, but the weight inside the car grew heavier with every passing mile. The road stretched on, endless, as the night deepened around him. Emily's presence lingered, invisible but palpable, and Daniel felt his mind unraveling under the pressure. He couldn't escape her, no matter how fast or far he drove. The memories of their last conversation replayed in his mind, a cruel reminder of everything he had lost, and everything he hadn't said. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. Daniel thought in anguish, why did it have to end this way? His thoughts circled back to their last fight, the things he regretted saying, and the things he wished he could take back. But now it was too late. Emily was gone, and he had to live with that. The only problem was he wasn't sure he could. Not with her shadow haunting his every move, not with the guilt that gnawed at his soul. The road stretched ahead, dark and empty, but Daniel barely saw it anymore. His mind was consumed by the ghost of Emily, by the image of her pale face, by the weight of her presence in the car. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was still with him, even though he couldn't see her. Daniel thought in panic, how do I fix this? How do I make it right? But there were no answers. Only the cold, the silence, and the endless road ahead. The soft rustling sound came again. Daniel stiffened, his hands tightening around the steering wheel. He didn't dare look in the mirror this time. He already knew what he would see. Emily, or whatever was left of her, was there, sitting silently in the back seat, waiting. Daniel could feel the air growing heavier, colder. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breath, but the sound persisted, the quiet, rhythmic sound of her breathing. Slowly, Daniel opened his eyes and glanced at the rearview mirror. She was there again, her pale face illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard lights. Her eyes, dark and hollow, were fixed on him, watching. Emily looked at him with blank eyes. Daniel's heart raced, his mind a whirl of fear and confusion. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to get rid of her, or if he even could. All he knew was that she was here, and she wasn't going to leave. Daniel's breath quickened, and his grip on the steering wheel tightened. He had to keep driving, had to stay focused, but the weight of Emily's presence was unbearable. He could feel her eyes on him, could hear the soft rustle of her movements in the back seat. It was as though she was waiting for something, but what, Daniel didn't know. All he knew was that he had to keep moving forward, even though each mile felt heavier than the last. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but Daniel's mind was spiraling. He couldn't stop thinking about their last conversation, about the cruel things he had said. He wanted to take them back, wanted to make things right, but it was too late. Daniel thought remorsefully, if I had just listened to her, if I hadn't been so stubborn. His thoughts were interrupted by a faint whisper from the back seat, soft and distant. He froze, his heart pounding. Had she spoken? He wasn't sure if he had heard it or imagined it. But the whisper came again, clearer this time. Why didn't you listen? The voice was soft, almost fragile, but unmistakable. It was Emily. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, where her pale figure sat motionless, staring at him.
Why didn't you listen to me?
Daniel felt a wave of guilt crash over him, stronger than ever before. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. What could he say? How could he possibly explain? The regret, the guilt, it was all too much. Daniel thought desolately, I'm sorry. Emily, I'm so sorry. His voice was barely a whisper, and yet it felt like the hardest thing he had ever said. He glanced back at the mirror, hoping for some sign that she had heard him. but her expression remained unchanged, her hollow eyes fixed on him, filled with sadness. The car was growing colder again, and Daniel could see his breath fogging up the air. He shivered, feeling the weight of her presence pressing down on him. What did she want from him? Forgiveness? Redemption? He wasn't sure if he could give her that. He wasn't sure if he deserved it. Emily's voice came again, soft and distant, but this time it was filled with a deeper sadness.
You never listened. Daniel, you never understood.
The weight of her words crushed him. Daniel's eyes stung with inched tears. She was right. He had never really listened to her, never truly understood what she needed. Daniel thought in despair, I tried, I really did. But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't enough. He had failed her, and now she was here, a ghost haunting him, because he had never given her what she needed in life. He had never given her the chance to be heard. Tears slipped down Daniel's cheeks, and he wiped them away quickly. His vision blurred as he focused on the road ahead, trying to keep himself together. But the grief was overwhelming, the guilt suffocating. How could he move forward from this? How could he ever make it right? The soft whisper of Emily's voice filled the car once more, haunting and sad. Emily speaks softly.
It's so late now.
Daniel's heart ached with the weight of her words. Too late, Daniel thought bitterly. Was it really too late? Could he ever find a way to forgive himself, to let go of the guilt that had consumed him since her death? The road stretched ahead, endless and dark, but Daniel felt like he was stuck in place. No matter how far he drove, he couldn't escape the memories, the pain, the ghost of Emily sitting silently in the back seat, reminding him of his failure. He wasn't sure how long he had been driving. Time seemed to blur, just like his vision. The only thing that felt real was the weight of Emily's presence. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see her gone, but she was still there, sitting quietly, watching him. Her face was as pale as ever, but there was something different now, a sadness deeper than anything he had seen before. Emily looks at him in silent pain. Daniel's voice trembled as he spoke, barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Emily, for everything. His words hung in the air, fragile and raw. He wasn't sure if she would respond, wasn't even sure if she could. But he had to say it. He had to try. He couldn't live with this guilt any longer. The car was silent, and for a moment, Daniel wondered if she had disappeared. But when he looked back in the mirror, her figure was still there, watching him. The silence inside the car was suffocating. Daniel's heart raced as he waited, unsure if Emily would respond. Then, finally, her voice came, soft, distant, but unmistakably filled with sorrow. Emily speaks softly.
It wasn't about the words, Daniel. It was about listening. Really listening.
Her voice echoed in his mind, piercing through his guilt. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had always known that deep down, but hearing her say it cut deeper. He felt his chest tighten as Emily's words sank in. I'm sorry, I should have listened, he whispered, his voice shaking. He didn't know if it would change anything, didn't know if it was enough. Daniel thought desperately, how do I fix this? But there was no answer, only the heavy silence of the car and the ghost of Emily sitting quietly behind him, watching. Her presence was a constant reminder of the past, of everything he had lost. The road stretched on, dark and endless, and Daniel kept driving, even though his mind was racing. He couldn't escape her, couldn't escape the memories that haunted him. Every time he looked in the mirror, she was there, her pale face watching him with those dark, hollow eyes. Her presence was a weight on his chest, a reminder of the things he hadn't done, the things he couldn't take back. Daniel thought desperately, how do I move forward from this? The cold inside the car seemed to grow stronger with every passing minute. Daniel shivered, but it wasn't the kind of cold that could be fixed by turning up the heater. It was deeper than that, a chill that came from within. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, expecting to see Emily, but this time she wasn't there. For the first time since the drive began, the back seat was empty. Daniel blinked, confused, his heart pounding. Was she gone? Daniel thought in doubt. He wasn't sure if he felt relief or fear. The absence of her presence was almost as unsettling as her being there. He kept glancing back, expecting her to reappear, but the back seat remained empty. The car felt lighter, the air less oppressive, but something told Daniel that this wasn't over. Emily might be gone for now, but he knew she would come back. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the lingering weight of her presence. As Daniel drove on, the road ahead seemed to blur, the lines between reality and his thoughts growing thin. He couldn't shake the feeling that Emily's absence was temporary. She had left something unsaid, something unfinished, and Daniel knew that until he faced it, she would continue to haunt him. The guilt was still there, gnawing at him, pulling him back into the past. He wasn't sure how to move forward, wasn't sure if he ever could. The silence in the car was thick, but Daniel couldn't find any peace in it. His mind raced with memories of Emily, of their last moments together, of the things he wished he could change. Daniel thought in anguish, if only I had listened. The thought echoed in his mind over and over again. He couldn't escape it, couldn't outrun it. The guilt was a constant shadow, following him no matter how fast he drove. And even though Emily wasn't there, he could still feel her. The road seemed to stretch on forever, dark and endless, but Daniel barely saw it anymore. His mind was lost in the past, in the memories of Emily, and the things he couldn't change. The cold in the car began to seep back in, slow and creeping. Daniel's breath fogged up in the air, and he knew she was back. He didn't need to look in the mirror to know it. He could feel her, the weight of her presence settling over him once again. He swallowed hard, his throat tight as he gripped the steering wheel. Daniel thought with fear, she's not gone. She'd never be gone. Emily's presence was stronger now, heavier, as if she was right behind him again. He could feel the chill in the air, could hear the faint rustling of movement, but he couldn't bring himself to look back, couldn't face her again. The weight of the guilt was too much, and he knew that as long as he carried it, she would never leave. The car was freezing now, the air thick with Emily's presence. Daniel's hands trembled as he drove, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. He didn't know how to escape her, didn't know how to break free from the past that haunted him. But deep down, he knew there was only one way. He had to face her, had to confront the guilt and the pain head-on. Only then could he hope to find peace. But the question was he ready? Daniel's heart pounded as he tried to gather the courage to look in the rearview mirror again. He knew she was there. He could feel her presence, heavy and cold, pressing down on him. But the fear of facing her, of confronting the reality of what he had done, was overwhelming. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he forced himself to glance at the mirror. And there she was, sitting silently in the back seat, watching him with those dark, hollow eyes. Her face was pale, just as it had been before, but now there was something different about her expression. It wasn't just sadness, it was something deeper, something more profound. Emily looks at him in deep pain, her lips parted, and for a moment, Daniel thought she was going to speak. He braced himself, his breath shallow, waiting for her words. But all that came was a soft sigh, like the wind slipping through the cracks of a door. The silence was more terrifying than any words could have been. Daniel clenched his jaw, his chest tightening with guilt and fear. Daniel thought desperately, what does she want from me? He wasn't sure if he could handle hearing her speak again, wasn't sure if he could face the truth of what she would say. But he knew he had to do something. He couldn't keep running from her, from the guilt that weighed him down. He had to find a way to let go, or she would haunt him forever. The road stretched ahead, dark and endless, but Daniel was trapped in the past. The silence inside the car grew thicker, more oppressive, and Daniel felt the weight of Emily's presence pressing down on him like never before. His throat tightened, and he struggled to find the words. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry, Emily." The words hung in the air, fragile and desperate. He wasn't sure if she would respond, wasn't sure if she would forgive him, but he had to try. It was the only way to find peace. For a moment, nothing happened. The car was silent, save for the soft hum of the engine. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then, slowly, he felt the air around him change. The cold seemed to lift just slightly, and the pressure on his chest eased. He glanced in the rearview mirror, and for the first time since the drive began, Emily's expression had softened. Emily looks at him understanding. Her pale face was still haunting, but the deep sadness in her eyes had lessened. She was still there, still watching him, but something had shifted. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Was she forgiving him? Daniel thought with hope, could it really be that simple? He didn't know, but he felt a glimmer of hope. He had spent so long running from the past, from the guilt, that he hadn't allowed himself to even consider forgiveness. Maybe now, maybe there was a chance. But as soon as that hope appeared, it was clouded by doubt. Daniel thought uncertain, and I forgive myself. He wasn't sure if it was possible. The things he had said to Emily, the way he had treated her in those final moments, they haunted him, gnawed at his conscience. Could he ever let go of the guilt? The weight of it pressed down on him again, and for a moment he felt like he was suffocating. The cold returned, creeping into the car once more, as if Emily's presence had intensified. The road ahead was still dark, but Daniel could see the faint outline of the horizon, where the first light of dawn would soon break. He knew he had to make a decision. He could keep running, keep driving through the night, trapped in this endless cycle of guilt and regret. Or he could face it. He could face Emily, face his past, and find a way to forgive himself. It was the only way to break free. The question was, could he do it? Was he ready to let go? As the silence stretched on, Daniel felt a tear slip down his cheek. He wiped it away quickly, his breath shaky. "I'm sorry, Emily," he whispered again, his voice trembling. "I should have listened to you. I should have been there for you." The words came out in a rush, and once they started, they didn't stop. "I should have been a better husband, a better person. I should have done more. I should have loved you the way you deserved." The weight of his confession settled over him, and for the first time Daniel felt a strange sense of relief. He had finally said the words that had been buried inside him for so long, but would it be enough? He glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Emily's expression change again, to see some sign that she had heard him, that she had forgiven him. But her face remained the same, pale, quiet, and haunting. She didn't speak, didn't move, she just watched. The silence in the car was heavy, and Daniel's heart sank. He had hoped for some kind of response, some sign that Emily had forgiven him. But there was nothing, just the stillness, the cold, and her pale, silent face in the mirror. His hands shook on the steering wheel. Daniel thought in anguish, what more can I do? He had said everything, confessed his guilt, poured out his heart. But it didn't seem to change anything. Emily was still there, still watching. As the road stretched ahead, Daniel felt the weight of his confession settle over him. He had done what he could, said what he needed to say. Now it was up to her, up to whatever was left of Emily's spirit. He couldn't force her to forgive him, couldn't make her leave. All he could do was wait, drive, and hope. The cold in the car seemed to ease slightly, and Daniel's breath came a little easier, but the silence was still there, thick and oppressive. The faint light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting a dim glow on the road ahead. Daniel blinked, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. He hadn't realized how long he had been driving, how far he had come. But now, as the first rays of light touched the sky, something shifted inside him. Maybe it wasn't about forgiveness. Maybe it wasn't about trying to make things right with Emily's spirit. Maybe it was about finding a way to forgive himself. He swallowed hard, his throat tight as the thought settled in his mind. Daniel thought of reflection, and I let go of this guilt. He didn't know if it was possible, didn't know if he deserved it, but he had to try. He couldn't keep living in the past, couldn't keep torturing himself over things he couldn't change. The cold air inside the car seemed to lift even more, and Daniel felt a strange warmth in his chest, a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could move on. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time Daniel felt like he could see the end. He didn't know where it would take him, didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he couldn't keep running from his past. He couldn't keep letting the guilt control him. Emily's presence in the back seat was still there, but it felt different now, lighter, less oppressive, as if she, too, was ready to let go. Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Emily's pale face was still there, watching him, but the sadness in her eyes had softened. Emily looked on with understanding. He could feel it, the shift, the change. Maybe she was ready to move on, too. Maybe they both were. A tear slipped down Daniel's cheek, but this time it wasn't from guilt. It was from the realization that he could finally find peace, that he could finally let go. Daniel thought of peace. "Thank you, Emily." As the dawn broke fully over the horizon, the first light of day filled the car, chasing away the shadows. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin. The cold inside the car had vanished, and with it, the weight of Emily's presence. He knew she was still there in some way, but she wasn't haunting him anymore. She was at peace, and so was he. It was over. The long drive, the guilt, the pain, all of it was behind him now. Daniel smiled, a small, fragile smile, as he looked out at the road ahead. It wasn't the end, but it was a new beginning, a chance to move forward, to live without the weight of the past pressing down on him. He knew there would still be hard days, still be moments when the memories of Emily would come back, but now he had something else, the knowledge that she had forgiven him, and that he could forgive himself. That was enough. As he drove into the new day, Daniel felt a sense of lightness he hadn't felt in years. The road ahead was clear, the weight of the past finally lifting from his shoulders. He would never forget Emily, never stop loving her, but now he could carry her memory with peace, not with guilt. Daniel thought of relief. "Goodbye, Emily." The words were soft, but they carried all the weight of his journey. He was ready to move on, to live again. The road stretched ahead, and for the first time, it felt like freedom. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting its warm light over the world. Daniel drove on, feeling the warmth on his skin, the peace in his heart. He wasn't alone anymore, not in the way he had been before. Emily would always be with him, but now she was a part of his past that he could finally make peace with. The long drive had come to an end, and with it, the pain that had haunted him for so long. Daniel was free, and for the first time he felt truly alive.